It started as a quiet Sunday in Brentwood, the kind of morning where everything feels ordinary, almost serene. Birds sang, the sun glinted off manicured lawns, and luxury cars hummed along the palm-lined streets. But behind the gates of one $13.5 million estate, the ordinary cracked wide open, revealing a horror that no one could have predicted. Rob Reiner, the legendary director and actor, and his wife Michelle, were found stabbed to death in a scene that would shake Hollywood to its very core. The perpetrator? Their own son, Nick Reiner, 32, living in the guest house of the sprawling property. And the story didn't end there. It spiraled into a web of shocking allegations, secret recordings, and a revelation that threatened to drag one of Hollywood's most celebrated directors, Martin Scorsese, into the darkest corners of a scandal no one wanted to face. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine for a moment being the person who discovered the bodies. For Romy Reiner, 27, that nightmare became reality. She stumbled upon the unthinkable, her family reduced to tragedy, her world shattered in a single, silent instant. And in that moment, she whispered something to the authorities that would become a focal point in a story the public would devour, a warning about a dangerous family member, someone who should be considered a suspect. But what she didn't know, what no one could have anticipated, was that the case would eventually implicate forces far beyond the walls of her family home. Forces that, until now, had seemed untouchable. The public would later learn of the CNN leak that made the story explode across screens worldwide, an audio recording, allegedly of Martin Scorsese himself, contacting the FBI with a plea that sounded almost impossible to believe. In the recording, Scorsese supposedly begged the agency to hide the terrible truth behind the Reiners' deaths. What could have been so shocking that it compelled one of the most respected filmmakers in history to intervene? And why would such a plea intersect with a crime committed by the very son of the victims? If you think you understand Hollywood power, think again. This isn't just a story about a family tragedy or a shocking murder. It's about influence, secrecy, and the lengths to which some will go to control a narrative. Martin Scorsese isn't just any filmmaker. He's a titan of cinema, a man whose work shaped generations, whose name carries weight in ways most of us can't comprehend. And yet, according to the leak, even he had a hand, or at least an interest, in controlling how the world saw the aftermath of a horrific crime. It's a concept that almost defies logic, yet the audio claims to document exactly that. But before we get too deep into the scandal, let's take a step back and understand the world the Reiners inhabited. Rob Reiner was more than a name in Hollywood. He was a symbol of storytelling mastery, the director behind iconic films that defined decades. His influence stretched beyond the screen. He was a voice in politics, a philanthropist, a man whose presence commanded respect. Michelle, his partner of decades, complemented him with grace and intelligence, known for her warmth and involvement in charitable endeavors. Together, they projected an image of a perfect, untouchable Hollywood couple, seemingly insulated from the chaos and corruption that often accompanies fame. But appearances, as always, can be deceiving. Nick Reiner lived in the guest house, a structure within the estate that was meant to provide him independence while keeping him close to family. For years, neighbors saw a young man who appeared to have opportunities, a privileged life within one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods. But within those walls, the story was far darker than anyone could see. The details emerging from the investigation painted a portrait of tension, secrecy, and ultimately, a fatal confrontation. And when the crime was discovered, Nick's actions would immediately become the centerpiece of public outrage, not just because he allegedly killed his parents, but because the circumstances surrounding the act were tangled with claims no one could have imagined. Among the most sensational claims was Nick's assertion that he had been paid by Martin Scorsese to commit the act. It's a statement that, if true, would rewrite every understanding of both Hollywood's inner workings and the Reiner family's private life. It challenges our assumptions about morality, celebrity, and the lengths people will go to protect or exploit those they admire or fear. And while such an allegation may sound like the stuff of tabloid fantasy, it's critical to remember that the foundation of the story rests on the very real discovery of two murdered lives and the undeniable presence of one family member charged with the crime. The CNN leak amplified every element of suspicion. Audio recordings, by their nature, carry an intimacy that nothing else can replicate. Hearing someone's voice in moments of panic or desperation allows us to glimpse motivations that would otherwise remain hidden. And the recording allegedly featuring Scorsese? It is a chilling reminder that the line between fame and fear, power and protection, can sometimes collapse entirely. The questions it raises are immediate. What truth was being concealed? Why did it matter so much to one of Hollywood's greatest directors? And how deep does this web go? From a storytelling perspective, this case is a masterclass in dramatic tension. Every character involved, the victims, the alleged perpetrator, the daughter, and the world-famous director, adds a layer of complexity. Each has motives, secrets, or reputations to protect. Every revelation has the power to shock, to alter public perception, and to provoke moral questioning. Who can we trust? Who was telling the truth? And, most importantly, what really happened inside that estate on that fateful day? As we move forward into this story, it's essential to note that the narrative will not follow a simple line from crime to consequence. The twists are many. There are moments where logic seems insufficient, where the weight of influence, legacy, and desperation collide in ways that are almost cinematic. Almost, but this is real life. Real lives have been lost, and real actions have triggered repercussions that extend beyond the private tragedy into the public eye. The stakes are enormous, not only for the Reiner family, but for the perception of Hollywood itself. If the allegations are true, they reveal a system where money, fame, and influence can intersect with tragedy in ways that ordinary people can scarcely imagine. They force the public to consider uncomfortable questions about celebrity accountability, the moral compromises of power, and the lengths some will go to protect their image, even if it means burying a terrible truth. And yet, despite the gravity of the situation, there is a perverse fascination in trying to unravel the mystery. Human nature is wired for curiosity, especially when scandal, family tragedy, and celebrity collide. The CNN leak serves as both a catalyst and a guide, providing glimpses of conversations, decisions, and emotional desperation that are as compelling as they are horrifying. As the story unfolds, we will examine every angle: the family dynamics, the investigation, the alleged interference by one of Hollywood's most powerful figures, and the shocking claims made by a son accused of unimaginable acts. By now, you might be asking yourself, could this really be true? Is it possible that Scorsese, the man behind some of the greatest cinematic achievements of our time, would be involved in concealing a crime? Could a family's worst nightmare be entwined with the machinations of Hollywood's elite? The answers are not straightforward. They require scrutiny, analysis, and, most importantly, a willingness to confront the contradictions and surprises that emerge at every turn. This is not a story that resolves neatly. It is a labyrinth of human emotion, moral ambiguity, and unanticipated revelations. And it all begins with that Sunday morning, the serene exterior of a Brentwood estate, the shocking discovery of two beloved lives ended too soon, and the immediate arrest of the son who was supposed to be safe, protected by the walls of a family home. From there, the layers of intrigue, suspicion, and secrecy begin to peel back, revealing a story that is as much about the power of influence as it is about the tragedy itself. It's easy to look at a family like the Reiners and assume you know the story. Rob Reiner, a towering figure in Hollywood with a career spanning decades, and Michelle Reiner, elegant, intelligent, and deeply involved in charitable work. Together, they projected an image of stability, success, and happiness. Their lives were chronicled in magazines, reported in interviews, and admired by the public. Yet behind the glimmering facade of awards, accolades, and Brentwood luxury, there were signs, small, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably there for those who looked closely, that not everything was as perfect as it appeared. The Reiners' home in Brentwood was a testament to their success. Sprawling grounds, manicured lawns, and a guest house that allowed their children independence while keeping the family close. To the outside world, it was a sanctuary, a safe haven where the trappings of fame and fortune provided protection from the chaos of Hollywood. Inside, though, the dynamic was more complicated. Rob and Michelle, like many couples with decades of shared history, had their routines, disagreements, and private tensions. Their children, Nick and Romy, had grown up in the shadow of fame and expectation, their lives shaped by both privilege and pressure. Nick, 32 at the time of the tragedy, lived in the guest house, a structure designed for autonomy, but still close enough to feel part of the family. Neighbors described him as quiet, sometimes withdrawn, but unremarkable. He was part of the world of wealth and opportunity, yet reports hinted at a disconnect, a sense that he was navigating pressures that few outside the family could understand. For years, those pressures remained largely invisible to the public, tucked behind the gates of the estate, masked by the outward stability of the Reiner name. Romy, 27, was the youngest in the family. Descriptions of her painted a woman deeply loyal to her parents, compassionate, and protective of her family's reputation. She was the one who would eventually stumble upon the scene that no one could have anticipated. Her role in the family had always been significant, but it was her presence on that tragic day that would make her voice central to the investigation. Romy's observations, her recollections, and her warnings to authorities would form a critical thread in the tapestry of events that unfolded, and her perspective would raise questions that the world would struggle to answer. Rob Reiner's career loomed large over the family, not just as a symbol of success, but as a framework for how the family navigated life. Known for classics like This Is Spinal Tap and When Harry Met Sally, his professional reputation was impeccable. He had an intellect, a charisma, and a presence that commanded respect. Michelle complemented this with a warmth and grace that made the pair seem invincible, a Hollywood power couple whose influence extended beyond film into philanthropy and advocacy. Their home, their lifestyle, and even their interactions with neighbors reflected this sense of achievement and control. But beneath the surface, the Reiner household was a complex ecosystem of expectations, unspoken rules, and subtle tensions. Every family has its undercurrents, the small disagreements that escalate in private, the resentments that fester unseen. For the Reiners, the pressures of fame, wealth, and public scrutiny added layers of complexity. Nick's behavior, often described as unpredictable or moody, was tolerated in some ways because of family loyalty, yet it hinted at underlying struggles that no one fully understood. It is important to note that there were no public signs of impending tragedy. To outsiders, the family was as unassailable as it had always seemed. The estate itself played a role in shaping the family dynamic. Brentwood is a neighborhood of carefully curated appearances, where privacy is currency and every detail contributes to a perception of perfection. Within that setting, a guest house might seem a minor detail, but it became a central element in the unfolding drama. Nick's life there represented both independence and proximity, a delicate balance between freedom and oversight. What exactly transpired inside those walls remains murky, but it is impossible to ignore the psychological weight of living in such close quarters to parents of such stature. Friends and acquaintances of the Reiners would later recall the subtle signs of tension, though none predicted the calamity to come. Small disagreements over money, career choices, or personal decisions may have seemed trivial at the time, but, when viewed in retrospect, hinted at cracks in the family's foundation. Romy herself would later reveal that there had been concerns about a dangerous family member, a phrase that now echoes with chilling significance. At the time, these concerns were private, nearly invisible to anyone outside the immediate household. Hollywood itself provides a lens through which to view the pressures on the Reiner family. Fame, while glamorous, carries unique burdens. Children of public figures often grapple with identity issues, expectations of success, and the constant gaze of an industry that scrutinizes every action. For Nick, growing up in the shadow of Rob Reiner's reputation may have contributed to a sense of inadequacy or frustration, though the precise psychological factors remain speculative. What is clear, however, is that the family dynamic was complex, layered, and ultimately fragile. In examining the life of the Reiners before the tragedy, it is impossible to ignore the interplay of public perception and private reality. To the world, Rob and Michelle were icons, embodiments of success and stability. To their family, They were parents navigating the challenges of raising children in a high-pressure environment, balancing love with expectations. And for Nick, the guest house represented both sanctuary and a prison of his own making, a space where freedom collided with obligation, and where emotions, tensions, and secrets would eventually erupt with catastrophic consequences. Yet despite all these pressures, there was no overt sign that the events of that fateful Sunday were imminent. Life went on as it always had, filled with routines, family dinners, professional obligations, and the quiet rhythm of existence within a well-to-do Hollywood household. The tragic events that would unfold were not foreshadowed in headlines, public appearances, or social media posts. They were hidden in the private corridors of the estate, known only to those living within it, and perhaps, in some way, to the forces beyond the family, who were soon to become entwined with the story. And then, as often happens in tragedies, it all changed in an instant. A single day would transform the Reiner household from a portrait of stability into the epicenter of a scandal that would grip the nation. The murder of Rob and Michelle, the arrest of Nick, and the shocking allegations involving Martin Scorsese would shatter the carefully maintained image of a perfect family. What had seemed secure, untouchable, and insulated from the chaos of the world became vulnerable, exposed, and horrifyingly real. The tension, the family dynamics, the pressures of fame, all of it collided in that one moment. And the questions began to multiply. What drove a son to allegedly kill his parents? How could a family with every advantage implode so catastrophically? And why, according to the CNN leak, was one of Hollywood's most revered figures allegedly begging the FBI to hide a truth so terrible that it could not be spoken aloud? But as the world would soon learn, the answers were not simple. The layers of secrecy, influence, and desperation would unfold in ways that no one could have anticipated. And yet, for those first moments after the tragedy, before the audio leak, before the accusations, and before the investigation dug into the dark corners of the family's life, the Reiner story was still a story of a family like any other, complicated, flawed, and deeply human. What came next? The discovery, the arrest, and the revelations that would follow would leave Hollywood stunned, the public horrified, and the world questioning just how deep the shadow of secrecy and influence truly ran. And the first cracks were about to appear, cracks that would widen into a chasm, revealing a darkness no one had imagined. It was a Sunday evening like any other, or so it seemed. The Reiner estate, tucked behind the guarded gates of Brentwood, radiated calm, the sort of quiet that comes only when the world outside fades into irrelevance. But inside, ordinary life was about to fracture in a way that no one could have foreseen. Rob and Michelle Reiner, having finished a day filled with routine meetings, calls, and family interactions, had no inkling that their lives were about to end in a scene of unimaginable horror. Neighbors later described the night as eerily silent, the kind of quiet that feels like a prelude to something you can't yet name. No one heard arguments, no one saw suspicious cars. Yet inside the sprawling estate, events were unfolding that would shock the nation. The first to discover the tragedy was Romy, 27, the youngest in the family. Her routine had taken her through the estate at an unremarkable hour, following a day that had been as normal as any Sunday. But what she encountered would leave her traumatized, a memory seared into her mind in painful detail. Rob and Michelle Reiner were dead, stabbed. Their lives ended violently within the home they had worked decades to build. The scene was chaotic, a stark contrast to the controlled elegance of the estate. The discovery was made in a state of shock and confusion. Romy immediately contacted authorities, her voice trembling as she relayed what she had found. Her words were measured but urgent, a plea for help and a warning simultaneously. In the midst of her recounting, she made a statement that would later take on enormous significance. She warned the police about a dangerous family member, someone who should be considered a suspect. At that moment, she likely could not have predicted the magnitude of the storm her words would unleash. The response from law enforcement was swift. Officers arrived at the estate, their presence a stark contrast to the serene neighborhood. Crime scene tape was quickly erected, and the sprawling property transformed from a picture of affluence and tranquility into a locus of investigation and suspicion. Detectives combed through the house, documenting evidence, taking photographs, and beginning the painstaking work of piecing together what had occurred. It was a process that would later reveal a shocking truth. The perpetrator was not a stranger, not a hired hand, not an intruder. The evidence pointed inward, directly at the Reiner's son, Nick. Nick, 32, had been living in the guest house, a structure designed to give him independence while keeping him close to the family. It was there that the investigation focused first. His presence on the property, his relationship to the victims, and his proximity to the scene made him an immediate person of interest. Within hours, law enforcement had moved to arrest him. The allegations were severe, 2 counts of first-degree murder. The magnitude of the accusations sent shockwaves through both the family and the surrounding community. Nick's arrest, however, was only the beginning. What followed would blur the lines between private tragedy and public spectacle. Reports emerged that Nick had claimed he was paid by Martin Scorsese to perform the act. At first, the idea seemed preposterous. How could one of cinema's most revered directors be implicated in a family murder? But the claim, amplified by the CNN leak of audio allegedly featuring Scorsese pleading with the FBI, added layers of intrigue, fear, and disbelief. Suddenly, this was no longer a simple story of family violence. It was a narrative involving influence, secrecy, and potentially shocking complicity. The media descended. Cameras, microphones, and reporters crowded Brentwood, their lenses capturing every detail, every reaction, every guarded expression. For a family that had lived under a veil of privacy, the intrusion was overwhelming. Headlines screamed accusations, speculations, and scandal. Social media erupted with theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd, as the public tried to make sense of a situation that seemed almost cinematic in its complexity. Investigators worked meticulously. Every room was documented, every object noted, and every timeline reconstructed. The guest house became a focal point, not just as the place where Nick lived, but as the potential origin of motives, planning, and preparation. It was here that detectives began to untangle the events leading up to the murders, examining relationships, communications, and the psychological undercurrents that may have influenced the tragedy. Meanwhile, Romy's statements remained crucial. Her identification of a dangerous family member directed attention to Nick, while also suggesting that the family had been aware of underlying issues. Questions arose. Had the parents taken measures to protect themselves? Had there been arguments, warnings, or tensions that could have foreshadowed the violence? The answers were as elusive as they were disturbing. Complicating matters further was the alleged involvement of Martin Scorsese. The audio recording that CNN leaked suggested that Scorsese had contacted the FBI, begging them to hide the terrible truth about the Reiner's deaths. The content of the audio was chilling. If authentic, it painted a portrait of a man with immense influence attempting to control the narrative of a horrific crime. But why? What could have compelled one of Hollywood's most celebrated directors to intervene in a case of murder? The possibilities were unsettling, ranging from protection of reputation to concealment of secrets that could have legal, financial, or personal implications. For law enforcement, the investigation became a labyrinth of conflicting information, intense scrutiny, and high stakes. Every lead had to be evaluated with extreme care, every piece of evidence verified. The involvement of high-profile figures, combined with the allegations made by Nick, created a scenario in which standard investigative protocols were complicated by the weight of public interest and celebrity influence. Meanwhile, the psychological dimension of the tragedy began to emerge. Observers noted the potential stressors in Nick's life. The pressures of living in a high-profile family, the expectations inherent in wealth and privilege, and the complex dynamics between parents and children. These factors, combined with the alleged financial or coercive involvement of Scorsese, suggested a convergence of stress, desperation, and influence that culminated in the murders. It was a narrative almost too extraordinary to be true, yet each piece of evidence, each testimony, each recording reinforced the grim reality. As the night unfolded and into the early hours, the gravity of the situation settled over Brentwood like a dark cloud. Neighbors whispered, reporters speculated, and the world began to grasp the enormity of the tragedy. What was meant to be a private, contained family crisis had erupted into a public spectacle of horror, intrigue, and suspicion. And yet, amid the chaos, one detail remained hauntingly clear. The events of that night were only the beginning. The discovery of the bodies, the arrest of Nick, and the leak of the Scorsese audio were all pieces of a puzzle that had no simple explanation. The next days, weeks, and months would reveal more twists, contradictions, and emotional upheavals than anyone could have anticipated. The night of the murders had shattered not only a family, but also the illusion of safety, privacy, and control that money and influence often provide. It was a stark reminder that no one, regardless of status or power, is immune to tragedy. And it raised a question that would haunt investigators, the public, and perhaps even the perpetrators themselves. How could a family so seemingly perfect be consumed by such a violent, incomprehensible act? When the authorities arrived at the Reiner estate that night, they were met with a scene that was both horrifying and surreal. The sprawling Brentwood property, usually a symbol of wealth, privacy, and stability, had become the epicenter of a crime so shocking that it threatened to shake Hollywood to its core. Detectives entered the main house first, documenting every detail, noting the chaos of a violent act that defied the calm exterior of the home. It quickly became apparent that the perpetrator was not an intruder or a stranger. It was someone close, someone who knew the rhythm and routines of the family intimately. Nick Reiner, 32, became the immediate focus of the investigation. Living in the guest house on the same property, he was in close proximity to the tragedy, and law enforcement had to consider both motive and opportunity. Within hours, he was taken into custody, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest alone was enough to ignite a media frenzy, but the events that followed transformed the case into one of the most talked-about and sensational stories in recent Hollywood history. From the outset, Nick's demeanor was described as unusual. While many expected panic, grief, or confusion, there were reports of him being strangely composed, almost detached, as he was escorted by officers. Friends and acquaintances would later recall subtle signs of tension in his personality, a simmering unrest that, when viewed in hindsight, hinted at the emotional storm that had been brewing beneath the surface. But even these observations could not fully prepare investigators or the public for the claims that Nick would make following his arrest. The most explosive of these claims involved Martin Scorsese, one of Hollywood's most revered directors. According to reports, Nick alleged that he had been paid by Scorsese to commit the murders of his own parents. At first, the claims sounded absurd, even impossible. How could a man of Scorsese's stature, an Academy Award-winning filmmaker, a titan of cinema, be connected to a crime of such personal and violent nature? Yet the accusation could not be ignored. It was a statement that introduced a layer of intrigue and disbelief, challenging both investigators and the public to consider a scenario that seemed almost cinematic in its audacity. The CNN leak that soon followed added fuel to the fire. Audio recordings, allegedly of Scorsese contacting the FBI, surfaced with content that was shocking in both tone and implication. In the recordings, the director purportedly begged the agency to conceal the terrible truth behind the Reiner's deaths. The language was urgent, even desperate, suggesting a man deeply concerned about what would be revealed if the investigation progressed unimpeded. For many, the existence of such audio raised immediate questions. What was Scorsese trying to hide? Why did he feel the need to intervene in a family tragedy of this nature? And, perhaps most importantly, was there any truth to Nick's claims? Investigators had to tread carefully. The presence of a high-profile name in such a case complicates every aspect of an investigation, from gathering evidence to managing media scrutiny to ensuring that procedures are followed without bias or interference. Every action had to be documented, verified, and corroborated. Every claim required validation. And in the midst of this meticulous process, the public's fascination only grew. Headlines screamed the allegations, social media debates erupted, and rumors circulated that blurred the line between fact and speculation. While the focus on Scorsese captured headlines, it was critical to remember the human element. 2 lives had been brutally ended, and the family's grief was overwhelming. Romy, having discovered the scene, was not only a witness but a central figure in the unfolding narrative. Her statements to law enforcement about a dangerous family member highlighted the complexity of the family dynamics and suggested that the tragedy might have roots in long-standing tensions, pressures, and conflicts. Investigators now face the dual challenge of understanding a family crisis while also navigating the extraordinary claims linking Hollywood elite to the crime. Nick's own story, as he recounted it to authorities and as reported later, was both disturbing and confounding. If taken at face value, his allegation that he had been financially motivated by Scorsese introduced motives and connections that seemed almost impossible to untangle. But in a case where wealth, influence, and secrecy intersect, even the most improbable claims demand consideration. Law enforcement had to approach each statement with caution, corroborating details, checking timelines, and evaluating psychological factors. Nick's mental state, his access to information, and the plausibility of his claims all became critical pieces of the investigative puzzle. The public reaction to Nick's arrest and allegations was immediate and intense. Social media platforms lit up with speculation, debates, and conspiracy theories. Fans of the Reiners and of Scorsese struggled to reconcile the claims with the public personas of the individuals involved. How could a filmmaker known for storytelling genius be implicated in such a heinous act? How could a son turn against his own parents in such a violent and calculated manner? These questions fueled discussion, fear, and fascination in equal measure. At the heart of the investigation was a stark truth. Nick's actions, whatever their motivation, had forever altered the course of his family's history. Rob and Michelle Reiner were gone, victims of violence that originated within the walls of the home they had built and nurtured. The psychological, emotional, and societal implications of the crime were immense, and the involvement, or alleged involvement, of a figure like Martin Scorsese added layers of complexity, intrigue, and moral ambiguity that few could have anticipated. Investigators soon began to piece together a timeline. From the evening routines of the family to the interactions within the guest house, every detail was scrutinized. The forensic evidence would later reveal the brutality of the murders, the precise movements of the perpetrator, and the methodical nature of the act. Each revelation, each fact confirmed, added weight to the already sensational allegations circulating in the media. Yet even as the investigation progressed, questions continued to mount. Was Nick acting alone, or was there a broader influence at play? Could the alleged financial involvement of Scorsese be verified? And what about the warnings Romy had given about a dangerous family member? Had they been taken seriously enough, or had tragedy been inevitable? The answers were buried beneath layers of secrecy, fear, and conflicting narratives, waiting for the painstaking work of detectives, journalists, and legal teams to uncover. By the end of that first night, one thing was clear: this was no ordinary criminal case. It was a convergence of family tragedy, celebrity influence, and allegations that challenged the very foundations of Hollywood ethics and morality. Every detail mattered, every statement had to be evaluated, and every revelation had the potential to change the narrative completely. The arrest of Nick Reiner, combined with his shocking claims and the subsequent leak of the Scorsese audio, set the stage for a story that would unfold over months, with twists, turns, and revelations that no one could have predicted. What had begun as a horrific murder now threatened to expose secrets far beyond the Reiner family, implicating figures and networks that the public had long assumed were untouchable. And as investigators dug deeper, the line between truth and speculation blurred. Each new piece of evidence, each witness statement, and each leaked recording raised more questions than it answered. The world watched, fascinated and horrified, as a family tragedy evolved into a narrative of suspense, intrigue, and moral complexity. It was a revelation that sent shockwaves through Hollywood and the world alike. A leaked audio recording, reportedly featuring Martin Scorsese, pleading with the FBI to hide a truth so devastating it could unravel lives, careers, and reputations. The leak, first reported by CNN, transformed the Reiner family tragedy from a horrifying domestic murder into a story with implications that seemed almost too extraordinary to be real. Yet the audio was out there, undeniable, and the questions it raised demanded answers. The leak arrived at a time when the world was already captivated by the arrest of Nick Reiner, 32, for the murders of his parents, Rob and Michelle. The public had followed every report, every update, and every rumor with fascination and horror. But the audio recording added a dimension that no one could have anticipated: the involvement of a Hollywood titan. Martin Scorsese, a man whose films had shaped the cultural imagination of generations, was allegedly asking the FBI to conceal a truth about a brutal family murder. The implications were staggering. From the moment CNN aired the report, the world was in disbelief. The audio, described by sources as authentic but unverified by independent forensic analysis, captured a voice that was urgent, anxious, and, some would say, desperate. In the recording, Scorsese allegedly implored federal authorities to suppress information about the murders of Rob and Michelle Reiner, a request that seemed both unprecedented and inexplicable. The leak raised immediate questions. What could possibly compel one of the most respected figures in cinema to intervene in such a deeply personal and criminal matter? And what was the truth that he so desperately wanted hidden? For investigators, the recording presented a complex challenge. Audio evidence is powerful but also susceptible to misinterpretation, manipulation, and exaggeration. Confirming its authenticity became a priority. Experts were brought in to analyze the waveform, vocal patterns, and environmental cues. Every nuance of the conversation was dissected: the tone of voice, the hesitations, the emphasis on certain words. To some, the recording sounded like a man grappling with guilt or fear. To others, it was evidence of deliberate interference in a criminal investigation. The content of the leak, as reported by CNN, was both chilling and confounding. Scorsese allegedly acknowledged knowledge of circumstances surrounding the Reiners' deaths that went beyond what had been publicly reported. He purportedly expressed fear that the revelation of this knowledge would cause irreparable harm to multiple lives and reputations. The language of the recording suggested a man aware of the gravity of the situation and desperate to contain its fallout. For those listening, the audio evoked not only shock but a sense of moral unease. If true, the director's actions blurred the line between protecting loved ones and obstructing justice. Public reaction was immediate and intense. Social media erupted with speculation. Headlines asked questions that seemed almost rhetorical. Could a family murder really involve a Hollywood director? Was Nick Reiner's claim that he had been paid by Scorsese credible? And what about the ethical implications for law enforcement? Would the FBI be swayed by fame and influence? The story rapidly became more than a domestic tragedy. It became a case study in power, secrecy, and the intersections of wealth, fame, and morality. Journalists and commentators debated the implications for weeks. Some argued that the leak was evidence of Scorsese's panic and desperation, a man seeking to shield himself or others from potential fallout. Others suggested it was a misinterpretation, a misunderstanding amplified by the sensational nature of the crime. Yet even skeptics acknowledged that the very existence of the recording, whether authentic or manipulated, added a layer of gravity to the case that could not be ignored. For the Reiner family, the leak was another blow. Already reeling from the murders of Rob and Michelle, they now had to contend with public scrutiny and the suggestion that their tragedy was entangled with one of Hollywood's most iconic figures. Romy, who had already been thrust into the spotlight by discovering the bodies, now found herself at the center of a storm of speculation and investigation. Her statements about a dangerous family member took on new significance as observers tried to reconcile her warnings with the broader narrative suggested by the audio leak. The leak also raised critical questions about motive. If Scorsese's involvement was real, why would he allegedly want to conceal information? Was it financial, reputational, or something far more personal? Could it have been related to influence over Nick or a desire to protect someone else? The possibilities seemed endless and terrifying. Each theory carried implications for the family, for Hollywood, and for the investigation itself. Investigators, meanwhile, were forced to operate under intense scrutiny. Every step they took, every decision they made, was observed and dissected by the public. They had to consider not only the immediate facts of the Reiner murders, but also the potential involvement of an external, high-profile figure who could exert pressure on the outcome. The leak introduced unprecedented complications, lines of inquiry that might never have existed in a typical murder investigation, questions of credibility, and the ethical challenge of separating fame from fact. The emotional impact of the audio leak cannot be overstated. To many, it transformed the Reiner murders from a shocking but isolated incident into a narrative about power, influence, and the lengths some will go to control the truth. For the public, it was impossible not to speculate. How could one family's tragedy intersect with the world of Hollywood elite in such a direct and alarming way? What secrets had been hidden behind the gates of the Brentwood estate, and who truly held the power to influence the investigation? And yet, despite all the speculation and analysis, the most important question remained unanswered. What was the terrible truth that Scorsese allegedly wanted the FBI to hide? Was it something directly related to the murders themselves? Was it connected to Nick's claims of being paid? Or was it a piece of information so sensitive that revealing it would upend everything, not just for the family, but for the public perception of Hollywood and those within it? As the days passed, more details emerged. Sources close to the investigation suggested that the audio was part of a larger pattern of behavior, indicating attempts to manage, influence, and potentially control the narrative around the murders. Legal experts debated whether the recording itself constituted evidence of obstruction or whether it was simply a reflection of panic and desperation. Regardless, the leak had irrevocably altered the landscape of the investigation. For viewers, readers, and followers of the story, the CNN leak offered a rare glimpse behind the curtain of celebrity, tragedy, and secrecy. It was a reminder that wealth and fame do not inoculate against tragedy, but they can complicate the way the world perceives, reacts to, and processes that tragedy. And while the recording raised questions about Scorsese, it also highlighted the human dimensions of fear, responsibility, and moral ambiguity. The leak became a pivot point, a moment when a story that might have remained focused on a family tragedy expanded into a cultural phenomenon. It forced society to grapple with the uncomfortable intersection of privilege, crime, and influence. The Reiner murders were no longer just a shocking domestic incident. They had become a narrative about power, morality, and the hidden forces that can shape outcomes behind closed doors. But despite all the public attention and scrutiny, one fact remained immutable. The events of that night, the murders themselves, and the allegations tied to Scorsese would continue to unfold with twists, revelations, and contradictions. Each new detail threatened to upend prior assumptions, forcing both investigators and the public to constantly reevaluate what they thought they knew. And what came next? The deeper truths, the hidden connections, the revelations that would shock even the most seasoned observers, were only beginning to emerge. From the moment the Reiner murders made headlines, the world began asking questions that seemed almost impossible to answer. How could a family, seemingly perfect and privileged, be destroyed from within? How could a son allegedly kill both of his parents? And why would one of Hollywood's most celebrated directors allegedly become involved? In the absence of clear answers, speculation flourished, and the public, journalists, and armchair detectives alike sought patterns, motives, and hidden truths. It began online. Social media exploded with theories, ranging from plausible psychological explanations to outlandish claims bordering on the absurd. Forums dissected every public appearance of Nick, every snippet of information about his upbringing, and even the Reiners' family photos. People speculated about financial disputes, hidden resentments, and long-standing family feuds. Some suggested that Nick, under immense pressure from growing up in a celebrity household, may have reached a breaking point. Others proposed darker, more deliberate motives tied to wealth or influence. Psychologists analyzing the situation pointed to the unique pressures of life in Hollywood. Children of famous parents often struggle with identity, expectations, and the relentless scrutiny of public life. For Nick, living in the shadow of Rob Reiner's fame and the family's wealth could have created a perfect storm of frustration, jealousy, and internalized anger. Yet even the most detailed psychological analyses could not fully explain why a person would allegedly commit such a violent act. The questions seemed endless. Was this a premeditated act fueled by financial incentive, as Nick claimed? Or was it a spontaneous eruption of pent-up emotion, magnified by family dynamics and psychological strain? The alleged involvement of Martin Scorsese added another layer of complexity to the speculation. If true, his actions suggested influence, secrecy, and possibly coercion. The CNN audio leak, in which Scorsese supposedly begged the FBI to conceal the truth, gave rise to theories that range from protecting the Reiner's reputation to hiding something that could implicate Scorsese himself. Was he covering up a misdeed, trying to shield the family from public scrutiny, or attempting to manipulate the investigation for unknown reasons? Each theory carried weight and consequences, yet none could be confirmed without further evidence. Media outlets jumped on the speculation, each offering its own interpretation. Some suggested financial motives, the Reiner's estate, their wealth, and inheritance potential as reasons for Nick's actions. Others focused on psychological explanations, unresolved familial tension, perceived favoritism, or the pressure of living up to parental expectations. Another wave of speculation connected the crime to Hollywood politics and influence, questioning how far the powerful could go to protect themselves or manipulate outcomes. Online communities, notorious for amplifying rumors, were particularly active. Conspiracy theories circulated with astonishing speed. Some suggested that the Reiners had discovered something about Scorsese or other industry figures that placed them in danger. Others proposed that Nick was being coerced or manipulated, acting not entirely of his own volition but under pressure from a figure with influence. Each new post, comment, or leaked snippet fueled the narrative, creating a feedback loop of curiosity, fear, and disbelief. Even law enforcement faced challenges due to the swirl of speculation. Detectives had to separate rumor from evidence, social media chatter from factual leads. Every piece of information was scrutinized, with investigators aware that public perception could influence witness statements, media coverage, and even judicial proceedings. Theories, no matter how far-fetched, had to be considered carefully because they could reveal hidden truths or lead investigators to overlooked details. Among the most persistent theories was the idea that the Reiners' deaths were tied to secrets buried deep within Hollywood itself. Scorsese's alleged involvement, according to the CNN audio, suggested that the truth being hidden was not just about the murders, but about something more significant, something that could affect careers, reputations, or personal safety. Did the Reiners know something someone wanted concealed? And if so, could Nick have been a pawn in a larger scheme? The questions were impossible to answer definitively, yet they dominated both professional and public speculation. Some theorists focused on financial motivations. The Reiners' wealth, their estate, and potential inheritance were obvious points of interest. Nick living in the guest house gave him both access and opportunity. Could greed have driven the act? Was there a financial incentive too powerful to resist? Nick's claim that he was paid, allegedly by Scorsese, seemed to support this line of thinking, but verifying such a claim proved nearly impossible. Others explored psychological and familial explanations. Nick may have felt alienated, pressured, or unappreciated, leading to rage and violence. Romy's statement about a dangerous family member lent credibility to the idea that warning signs existed but were either ignored or underestimated. Investigators and psychologists alike emphasized that familial violence often stems from long-term emotional dynamics, not a single triggering event. But in the Reiners' case, the convergence of wealth, fame, and public scrutiny magnified every factor. Then there were the more sensational theories, fueled by the alleged involvement of Scorsese. Some claimed the director had a vested interest in controlling public perception, perhaps to protect a career, reputation, or hidden secret. Others suggested the audio leak itself could have been manipulated, a calculated move to misdirect or obscure the truth. The presence of the audio, combined with Nick's allegations, created a narrative that seemed more like fiction than reality, but this was real, and every detail mattered. Theories about coercion and manipulation also emerged. Could Nick have been influenced, threatened, or financially incentivized to act? Was he following instructions from someone he trusted or feared? The possibility that someone powerful could engineer events to achieve a desired outcome introduced an unsettling layer to the investigation. The public grappled with the idea that fame and influence could reach into private tragedies, shaping outcomes in ways ordinary people could never imagine. Even within the family, speculation was rampant. Romy's role as both witness and family member became a focal point. Had she underestimated the danger within her own household? Could she have done something to prevent the tragedy? And as investigators pieced together timelines and statements, the internal dynamics of the Reiners family, love, loyalty, fear, resentment, became central to understanding what had unfolded. Meanwhile, legal analysts began to dissect the implications of Nick's claims and the CNN leak. Could allegations of being paid by Scorsese affect his culpability, his defense strategy, or the outcome of a trial? What legal weight did the audio carry, and how would courts interpret a celebrity's attempt to influence an investigation? These questions added yet another layer of intrigue and complexity to an already confounding case. Through all the speculation, one reality remained immutable. 2 lives had been brutally ended, and the family's world would never be the same. Every theory, no matter how compelling, had to contend with the human cost of the tragedy. The deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner were real, painful, and irreversible, and their impact extended beyond the estate, touching friends, colleagues, and the public in ways that were deeply felt. Yet the questions refused to stop. Who could truly be trusted? Was Nick acting alone, or was there influence from outside the family? Was Scorsese involved in some way, or was he merely a figure caught in a storm of rumors and allegations? And perhaps most importantly, what was the truth hidden in the audio, and how would it shape the investigation, the trial, and public perception? Theories multiplied, evidence accumulated, and the story continued to unfold with twists, contradictions, and revelations that confounded both professionals and the public. Each new detail threatened to rewrite the narrative, forcing a constant reevaluation of motives, suspects, and consequences. What began as a domestic tragedy had become a puzzle with pieces too strange, too complex, and too shocking for any ordinary framework to contain. And yet, amid all this speculation, one certainty remained. The next revelations, about motive, about influence, and about hidden truths, would shock everyone, even those who thought they understood the story. No one could have fully imagined the trauma that Romy Reiner experienced that night. At 27, she was the youngest member of a family suddenly thrust into a nightmare she would never escape. The discovery of her parents' lifeless bodies transformed her world in a way words could scarcely capture. Yet it was her voice, her observations, and her actions in those moments that would become a cornerstone of the investigation into one of the most shocking crimes in Hollywood history. Romy had grown up in the shadow of fame. Her father, Rob Reiner, was a towering figure in entertainment, a man whose influence reached far beyond the screen. Her mother, Michelle, was a stabilizing presence, known for her intelligence, warmth, and charitable endeavors. From the outside, their family appeared ideal, successful, cohesive, and untouchable. Yet, as anyone who studies families knows, appearances can be deceiving. Behind the veneer of luxury and accomplishment lay tensions, unspoken resentments, and dynamics that only those living within the household could truly understand. On the night of the tragedy, Romy's routine brought her through the estate in the early evening. She was unprepared for what she would find. Entering the main house, she was confronted with a scene of violence so stark and incomprehensible that it defied reason. Her parents, victims of brutal stabbings, lay motionless. The sight alone was enough to send shockwaves through her mind and body. Every detail of the scene, disarrayed furniture, bloodstains, and the eerie silence, imprinted itself on her memory, a trauma that would haunt her forever. Despite the shock, Romy acted with remarkable presence of mind. She called authorities, her voice trembling but urgent, providing critical information about the scene. She also made a statement that would become crucial to the investigation. She warned police about a dangerous family member, someone who should be considered a suspect. At that moment, Romy's instincts as a daughter, a sister, and a member of the household intersected with the demands of reason and urgency. She did what many might not have been able to do under such extreme circumstances. Romy's warning suggested a level of awareness that investigators would later scrutinize closely. Had she observed warning signs, tensions, or behavioral patterns in her brother that foreshadowed violence? Did she understand the psychological pressures he was under, the unresolved conflicts that may have escalated to murder? Her insight offered a critical perspective on the family dynamics that preceded the crime. It was a reminder that, even in the midst of tragedy, those closest to the events often have valuable knowledge about the underlying causes. Her perspective also illuminated the emotional complexity of the family. Romy's relationship with Nick had been multifaceted, marked by typical sibling dynamics of love, rivalry, and occasional conflict. She described moments of tension, disagreements, and unease, but nothing that, at the time, suggested the potential for such extreme violence. Her reflections highlighted the difficulty of predicting human behavior, especially when private tensions remain hidden from view. Romy's own grief and shock were compounded by the sudden intrusion of public attention. As news of the murders spread, she became a focal point for journalists, social media commentators, and the broader public. Every statement she made, every interview she gave, was scrutinized for insight into the family and the crime. The pressure of living under such scrutiny, while grappling with unimaginable loss, created a dual burden. Mourning her parents while simultaneously navigating the glare of global attention. Psychologists studying the case noted that Romy's response was both remarkable and telling. Her ability to provide clear, actionable information under extreme stress demonstrated a level of resilience and composure that few could muster. Yet the emotional toll was undeniable. Survivors of family homicide often experience complex trauma, including guilt, anxiety, and long-term psychological distress. Romy's experience would become a case study in how tragedy intersects with responsibility, familial loyalty, and public exposure. Romy's statements also provided investigators with crucial insight into Nick's potential motivations and state of mind. She described patterns of behavior, emotional volatility, and moments of tension that, in retrospect, painted a more complete picture of the family environment. This perspective was invaluable, helping law enforcement piece together the psychological and relational context surrounding the murders. Without her observations, investigators would have been forced to rely solely on physical evidence and statements from third parties, leaving critical gaps in understanding. Beyond the investigation, Romy's perspective offered a human dimension to the narrative that captivated the public. While headlines emphasized the sensational aspects of the crime, the alleged involvement of Martin Scorsese, the brutal murders, and the dramatic CNN audio, her account reminded the world of the personal toll. This was not merely a story of fame, influence, or scandal. It was a story of loss, grief, and the profound consequences of violence within a family. Her reflections also raised questions about prevention and foresight. Could the tragedy have been avoided? Were there warning signs that went unheeded? Was there a way for family members, authorities, or mental health professionals to intervene? These questions remain unresolved, highlighting the difficulty of anticipating extreme acts of violence even in environments where warning signs exist. Romy's voice, however, ensured that these questions remained central to the public discourse, adding depth and nuance to a narrative often dominated by sensational speculation. The CNN audio leak, while explosive, also intersected with Romy's experience in a deeply personal way. Allegations involving Scorsese added layers of complexity and fear, raising questions about external influence and intervention. For Romy, the possibility that someone outside the family could be connected to her parents' deaths compounded her trauma, intertwining grief with disbelief, fear, and moral confusion. Her perspective underscores the human consequences of actions taken both within and outside the family unit, revealing the ways in which power and secrecy can intersect with personal tragedy. In addition to her role as a witness, Romy's interactions with law enforcement, media, and the public became a window into the broader cultural and societal implications of the case. Her insights illuminated how family dynamics, celebrity influence, and tragedy intertwine, offering lessons in both human psychology and the complexity of navigating grief under public scrutiny. Through her eyes, the world could see not only the horror of the crime, but also the resilience, courage, and determination required to face such unimaginable circumstances. Yet, Despite her strength and clarity, Romy's perspective leaves unanswered questions. How deeply had Nick's actions been influenced by external forces? Was the alleged involvement of Martin Scorsese a factor in what unfolded, or merely an element of sensational reporting and speculation? And perhaps most poignantly, could any warning, observation, or intervention have changed the course of that fateful night? The answers remain elusive. Romy's experience is a testament to the complexity of human behavior, the fragility of family bonds, and the unpredictable intersections of personal, psychological, and external pressures. Her voice is essential not only to understanding the immediate events of the murders, but also to grappling with the broader implications of influence, secrecy, and tragedy in a world where private and public lives collide in dramatic and sometimes devastating ways. And as investigators, journalists, and the public continue to parse the events of that night, one truth becomes unavoidable. The perspective of those closest to the tragedy, like Romy, is not only compelling, it is indispensable. It guides understanding, shapes narratives, and offers insight into questions that might otherwise remain forever unanswered. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming.